you got a copy of your scriptures, I want to read to us a couple verses starting in Mark chapter 4, and it's going to maybe feel like a lot, but I think you'll understand why in a minute. Mark chapter 4, I want to read to you several verses starting in verse 35. And if you got a copy of scriptures you want to open, great. If you normally look at the scriptures on a phone, you can do that, but I would just encourage you maybe, to try to put the phone down. I know for some of you that may be hard to do, but we got these big screens and the verses will be on there, so we don't need the little screen. The big screens will have it. And maybe you can just see what it feels like to not be holding a phone. Mark chapter 4, starting in verse 35, it says this. On that day, when evening had come, he said to them, "Let us go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd, they took him and went with them in the boat, just as he was, and other boats were with him. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking into the boat, so that the boat was already filling. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we're perishing?" And he awoke and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. And he said to them, "Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great fear and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" They came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes, and when Jesus had stepped out of the boat, immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit. He lived among the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain. For he had often been bound with shackles and chains, but he wrenched the chains apart and he broke the shackles in pieces. No one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always crying out and cutting himself with stones. And when he saw Jesus from afar, he ran and fell down before him, and crying out with a loud voice, he said, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me." For he was saying to him, "Come out of that man, you unclean spirit." And Jesus asked him, "What's your name?" And he replied, "My name is Legion, for we are many." And he begged him earnestly not to send him out of the country. Now there was a great herd of pigs was feeding there on the hillside, and they begged him, saying, "Send us to the pigs and let us enter them." So he gave them permission. And the unclean spirits came out and entered the pigs, and the herd, numbering about 2,000, rushed down the steep bank into the sea and drowned in the sea. The herdsmen fled and told it in the city and in the country, and people came to see what it was that had happened. And they came to Jesus and saw the demon-possessed man, the one who had the legion, sitting there clothed and in his right mind. And they were afraid. And those who had seen it described to them what had happened to the demon-possessed man and to the pigs. And they began to beg Jesus to depart from the region. And as he was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed with demons begged him that he might be with them, and he did not permit him. But he said, "Go home to your friends. Tell them how much the Lord has done for you, how he's had mercy on you." And he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone marveled. And when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was beside the sea. And there came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and seeing him, he fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, so she may be made well and live." And he went with him. And a great crowd followed him and thronged about him. And there was a woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years, who had suffered much under many physicians, spent all that she had, was no better, but rather grew worse. She'd heard the report about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his garment, for she said, "If I touch even his garment, I'll be made well." And immediately the flow of blood was dried up. She felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. And Jesus, perceiving in himself that the power had gone out from him, immediately turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my garments?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing around you, and yet you say, 'Who touched me?'" And he looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith's made you well. Go in peace, be healed of your disease." And while he was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house some who said, "Your daughter's dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." And he allowed no one to follow him except Peter and James and John, the brother of James. And they came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, and Jesus saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. And when he had entered, he said to them, "Why are you making a commotion and weeping? Child's not dead, sleeping." And they laughed at him. But he put them all outside, took the child's father and mother and those who were with him, and went in where the child was. And taking her by the hand, he said to her, "Talitha kumi," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, rise." And immediately the girl got up and began walking. She was about 12 years of age. And they were immediately overcome with amazement. And he strictly charged them they should tell no one about this. And he told them to give her something to eat. Well, Father, I pray you would help us now as we talk about your word, understand what it means about who you are and what you're like. But I pray we wouldn't just understand it in our minds, although I ask for your grace to quicken our minds, we could settle in and focus. But I pray it would affect us, that we'd believe it, and it would change us. I'm asking for life change on night 1 of Passion, and I can't generate that, but you can. And I just want to ask you guys, if you're up for it, maybe you haven't done this in a long time, but you take a minute and ask him, if you're willing, say, "God, please teach me tonight." And then if you would, please pray for me, that the Lord would use me and I'd be helpful to you. Well, Father, we love you and we trust you. Use this time, we pray in Jesus' name, amen. Well, when Donna and I got married, we honeymooned in Jamaica, which we were excited about going someplace tropical, but we were surprised when we got there and began to snake along this little road along the coast that all these resorts were surrounded by high walls with spikes on the top, and ours was no different. And so I understood that was for our protection, to keep danger out, but it kind of had the effect of making it feel like we were in a luxury prison. And so we got there and, it was fun. I mean, come on, it was our honeymoon. But the food was just okay, and the beach was fine. I mean, no one was swimming in the water, and the resort was just okay. And so after a few days, we were like, Jamaica's fine. It's kind of like Galveston, I guess, is sort of how we felt. But then something about that felt wrong. Like, I don't think this is right. And so for our last full day, I just said, we got to get out of these walls, man. And so I got a taxi for the whole day. I remember we woke up that morning and we went down to the taxi and got in it, and there was a 70-year-old man named Sylvester driving. And he said, "Where do you want to go?" And I said, "I want to see Jamaica." And I remember he just turned around and looked right at me and nodded. And you could tell that was the right thing to say to Sylvester, because this man had lived his whole life in this country and he loved it. And so he took off, and it wasn't 5 minutes before we were like, there's the turquoise water, there's the white sand beaches, there's the lush jungle. And he's watching us like grip the glass, freaking out. And as he's seeing us get excited, he's getting excited. And then at one moment he just turns around and goes, "Do you want to try a jelly coconut?" And we were like, yes. I don't know what that means, but yes. And he pulled over, and this guy emerged from the jungle with a machete and cut down these coconuts and split them open, and we ate them, and it wasn't that dry, chalky coconut. It was like soft and sweet. And then we drove on a little further, and he looks back and says, "Do you want to try sugar cane?" And we said, yes. And so we pulled over, and a guy emerged from the jungle with a machete. It sort of became a theme, and cut down some sugar cane. And I took one bite and was like, I don't care what this is doing to my teeth, I will always gnaw on you for the rest of my life. It was amazing. He drove us to the Blue Lagoon. There was nobody there. It was just me and Donna swimming in the Blue Lagoon. He took us to a waterfall I had really wanted to see, and when we got there, the government had closed it, but he drove us in anyway. Which I'm not advocating, I'm just telling you a story. But as we got there, 3 guys emerged from the jungle, just wearing shorts, and they just kind of surrounded the vehicle, and I started getting nervous, and they started talking to Sylvester, but they were talking really fast and with a lot of inflection in their language. I couldn't understand a word of it. And then I remember after they had talked for a while, Sylvester turned around to Donna and I, and he said, "All right, you're gonna go to Rastaman. You're gonna take you to the falls. I'll be here when you get back." And I was like, did you just say we're gonna go with the Rasta man into the jungle? And I remember I just thought, Huge mistake. Like, I've been a husband for 3 days and we just became a cautionary tale. Like, I had one job, but we did it and walked down there, and it turned out he was very nice. About 40 years old, father was telling us about his kids, and he kind of walked us down to this waterfall, and Donna and I swam while he sat on the shore and smoked a huge joint. And again, not advocating, just telling you a story. But as we got out of the water, remember, we got back to the cabin, Sylvester's waiting, and we got in there, and we still had the water on us, and we were just eating the fruit of the country. And I remember at that point, we were all laughing together and just celebrating, and it struck me, we were so close to leaving Jamaica and saying it was fine. And yet we had to get out of the safety of our shallow little experience to really get out there. And it dawned on us, oh, we had been in Jamaica, but we hadn't been in Jamaica. But when we experienced it, experiencing became celebrating. It was easy at that moment. But to really experience it, we had to step out of our shallow and safe places and move into some deeper and more dangerous ones. Now, why am I telling you this? Because honestly, statistically speaking, and many of you know this, your generation is not doing so good. Jean Twenge is a professor of psychology at San Diego State University who's compiled extensive research about your generation, and she reports that in your teenage years, the number of 12 to 15 or 17-year-olds with major depression rose dramatically. And this couples well with CDC research that's come out recently that said if you were in high school in 2019, then 1 out of 3 of your peers indicated that they feel a persistent sense of sadness or hopelessness. I mean, look around this room and imagine 1 out of 3 persistently feeling a sense of hopelessness. Who should be more hopeful than the young? And yet they look forward and say, I don't see good coming in my life. And those numbers were 40% higher than 10 years before. And they're even higher now. And some of you may hear that and go, yeah, Ben, but aren't we as a generation just more comfortable talking about our feelings than those older people? But you grab some objective facts like hospitalizations for self-harm or suicide, and they've increased dramatically among your generation, and they've risen among 10 to 14-year-olds, a demographic that has never been on those charts. And self-reported loneliness has increased sharply in your generation during your teenage years. Stunningly, 31% more sophomores felt lonely in 2015 than in 2011. And a rising number of your peers would agree with the statements, I often feel left out or lonely, I can't do anything right, my life is not useful, I do not enjoy my life. Now, we went quickly through these charts, but I want you to point out something about them that was interesting that maybe was hard to see in a moment. If you look at these, all these sharp inclines of these negative outcomes within your generation all have a moment where they begin to rise sharply, and that moment was the year 2012. Which begs the question, what happened in 2012? Well, that was the year in America, for the first time, the majority of teenagers were on social media. Not cell phones. Those came out in 2007, but the majority of young people on social media, this brand new, groundbreaking way of having a human experience coming out in your most developmental moment. And yet here's the thing, there's surprisingly good news to this, because what that means is all this negative stuff, the depression, the sadness, all that, it's not physical, it's not biological. It's not like, well, you know, your parents didn't eat enough iron, so constitutionally you're just a weak people. Like, that's not it. You're the same as every generation before you. Beautiful in the image of God, desperately broken because of sin. You're like all of us. It's not biological, it's not physical, it's environmental. That the atmosphere changed around you, a massive shift in human experience during your most critical years of development has cost you, and we're just now seeing the cost it's really wrought on you. So here's the crazy thing, it's not your fault, but it is your problem. Every generation gets a challenge, this one's yours, and we have to figure out how to deal with it. And yet here's the fascinating thing, Jonathan Haidt is an atheist and a social psychologist at New York University. Many of you have probably not read his work, but he's read you, and he studied your generation. And in his research, he's found something fascinating. He says when young people get on experience blockers, which is what he calls cell phones, he says they engage you all the time. And he said, the effect is like having someone constantly tap on your shoulder. You have to look. But he said the constant interruption impedes deep thinking. But it's only in deep thinking that we find depth and find meaning. That the constant interruption keeps us in the shallows. And because we can't think deeply and focus deeply, then we can't accomplish more and we feel more empty. And he says the problem is, for your generation, is you're being invited to constantly dwell in shallow places. It's like a fish growing up in a rain puddle. It's not capable of reaching its full potential. Your challenge as a generation is you are bombarded by triviality. And you've been dwelling in shallow places when the deeper frequencies are needed. And so here's the craziest thing. He was in an interview recently, and again, as an atheist, he was asked about your generation. He says, here's my greatest concern for this generation. With that constant interruption, that inability to think deeply, he says, my greatest fear for this generation is they stand in awe of nothing. He said, feeling awe is key for healthy development for a human being. He says, I don't understand why, but we're rigged in a way where we are meant to feel awe and in order to develop into what we're meant to be as human beings. Awe he defines as the perception of vastness that requires accommodation. That I see something so overwhelmingly beautiful or powerful or glorious or wonderful, and it's so amazing, it cannot fit in my existing mental structures, so it does not move, I move. I am transformed as the result of an encounter. And he says, my great concern for this young generation is because of all the interruption, they stand in awe of nothing. His diagnosis is you need awe to feel the smallness before overwhelming reality, to feel the pull away from the shallow spaces and into the deeper places, to become what you're meant to be. And let me tell you, this is my concern for many of you with your Christianity. Your Christianity is, you've seen it. You go, yeah, I've read some of the Bible, it's fine. I've been to church, it's fine. I've seen Jesus, it's fine. And you've not been stunned by his beauty. You've not been overwhelmed by his majesty. You've not been captivated by his grace. And it's not that those things aren't there. You've just had a version of it that's been caged and small. And really, you haven't delved deep into who he is. But you're made for more. And for many of us, our version of Christianity is just too small. Our vision of Jesus too obscured. Our appreciation is too shallow. We think he's just fine because we haven't really tasted and seen that the Lord is good. But you were made for more. And in the few moments I have left, I just want to be a 70-year-old cabbie who tries to drive you into some deep places. Now, here's the thing. There's a lot of places we could go at this moment. We could go to Genesis 1 and be stunned as God spins the world into existence. We could crawl into the cleft of the rock with Moses and watch the glory of God pass by. But 2 Corinthians 4 says this, the God who said, let light shine out of darkness has shone into our hearts to give us the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. The same God who made the sun and spun the stars into existence shines into hearts to give us the knowledge of his glory. And where do we see it? In the face of Jesus. So I want us to look at him, because I can't make you feel awe, but I can show you him, and he is awesome. And maybe here at Passion, you will begin to grab a sense of awe as God shines a light into your heart to give you the knowledge of him. And so it's interesting, in the passage that we read, Jesus had been teaching about the kingdom, and he had been telling right before a group of people that the kingdom of heaven was at hand. He's saying the kingdom's here because the king is here. But then he says, hey, it's not gonna be like you expect. It's not a military coup, it's like a mustard seed. I'm coming humble, but what I'm beginning will span around the globe. But as he teaches that, it's different than what they expected, and there's some doubt about whether or not he's the real guy. His disciples are uncertain, should we trust Jesus with our life? And then Mark gives us these three moments that are usually taught individually, maybe should be, but we read them all together. Why? Because I don't know if you picked up the link. They were all one crazy boat ride with Jesus. So I want us to go on the ride. And we're gonna see the power of Jesus and the purpose of Jesus and the priorities of Jesus. And I don't think I got those from Tim Keller. But I know at this moment it's probably worth mentioning that he and Darrell Bach's thinking really shaped my own on this passage. But with that said, let's jump in to the power of Jesus. And you saw it when they got into the boat. It said in verse 35, on that day, the same day he had been teaching, when evening had come, he said, let's go across to the other side. And they get into the boat, and it says a great windstorm arose. Now, windstorms were common. That was a sea that was in a basin between mountains. But this was called a great windstorm, and it's at night. And it's so bad, it says the waves were breaking into the boat so that the boat was filling. It's bad enough that it's swamping the boat, and it's beginning to rattle the prows. Guys who had been fishing on that sea their entire lives aren't sure they're gonna make it. And then they look over, and while the waves are rising up, Jesus has gone down into the stern and fallen asleep. So they run and grab him, and they ask the question, teacher, do you not care that we're perishing? Interesting in that moment, what's certain to them and what's uncertain. What's certain is we're perishing. What's uncertain is, do you care? And are you powerful enough to do something about it? And if we're honest, for many of us, when the storms hit our life and uncertainty and difficulty, the storm is our reality. It's everything. But does God powerful enough to do something about it? Does God care? That's what we begin to doubt. And here in this moment, their pain and their fear creates uncertainty, and they bring that uncertainty to Jesus. They sound like us, his love and power questioned in a moment of chaos. And then in verse 39, it says, he awoke and he rebuked the wind and said to the sea, peace, be still. Now it's interesting that that's really in Greek, those are two words that basically mean be quiet. And one he puts in the present tense and one he puts in the perfect tense, meaning a settled state with ongoing implications. And so literally Jesus stands up and goes, be quiet and stay quiet, which is a weird thing to say to weather. But what's weirder is it doesn't. And it says the wind ceased, which could have been coincidence, but then it says, and then there was a great calm, like there's a dead calm. That's eerie, that's disturbing, that you're in the middle of the storm, it's overwhelming, we're all gonna die, I can't believe this, God, you care, show it. And then the story ends with Jesus looking at him and saying, do you not know who you're dealing with by now? He goes back to sleep. And I love the way Mark ends the story. He ends it by saying, and they were filled with great fear and said to one another, who then is this that even the winds and waves obey him? Who does that? Seriously, who does that? Who talks to nature and nature obeys? Well, if you know the Bible, it has an answer in Psalm 89. It says, O Yahweh, God of hosts, who is mighty as you are, you rule the raging sea, and when its waves rise, you still them. Only God can control nature like that. Only God rules reality, and this man just took the prerogatives of nature, of God, and nature agreed. I love the way Keller says it. He says at that moment, he says, that closes the door on just listening to a sermon about Jesus and trying to figure out if it works for me or not. Like, I'll listen to Jesus' advice and I'll decide if it fits into my life. He says, no, Jesus commands reality. He is Lord, whether you like it or not. And some of us don't like to hear that because we want to believe we have control over our life. Some of us, you don't even like considering things like this because you're like, no, I want to have control over my life. You hate it when things are out of control in your life. You don't like the idea of somebody else that can take control of your life. It's disturbing that there might be a sentient being that can rule things that are out of your control that will impact you. And notice with the disciples, they felt the same way. Were they comforted at the end? Did they go, Jesus, he did it again. He took the wheel. He took it from my hands. Is that what they say? No, it says they were even more afraid. Because there's only one thing scarier than a storm that'll kill you. It's a guy who can control storms that'll kill you. And for many of us, me saying to you, hey, Jesus is Lord over your life, whether you believe it or not, you don't like that. That scares you. Because maybe there have been some people who had authority over your life that use that power to hurt you, and you don't trust anybody. And so when I tell you major realities about you are controlled by this person, you go, I don't like this sermon. But before you dismiss the power of Jesus, I want you to see the purposes of Jesus. And that's what happens in the next moment. In 5:1, it says they came out to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes, and when Jesus stepped out of the boat, immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit. Which is awesome because, you know, if you were the disciples, The storm was the story. Like, you got out of that boat, you're like, that was crazy. We almost died, that was nuts. Like, you were crying. Don't act like you weren't crying, Thaddeus. Like, that's crazy. But as you get out of the boat, suddenly you're met by a naked, demon-possessed man at a full sprint running at you. Oh, that was so, Because life with Jesus is never boring. So you think this is gonna be another story about Jesus' power. Jesus has the Holy Spirit, that guy has an unholy spirit, they're gonna cross lightsabers, it's about to go down. But that's not how it goes. The man falls at Jesus' feet immediately. There's no contest between light and darkness. And as the man steps to Jesus, Mark begins to tell the man's story. And Mark doesn't give you all kinds of details, but he stops on this guy and he says, hey, this man had an unclean spirit. That word means defiled. That he got into some things. He started playing with some things and they defiled him. He was violated. And so he lived among the tombs. He was isolated from society. And no one could bind him anymore. Did you notice that? That means they used to be able to. That means he started playing with some things and then suddenly over time realized he's not playing with them, they are playing with him. And he thought he was in control, but what he had gotten into is now controlling him. And no one can bind him anymore. And night and day he was on the tombs and in the mountains, always crying. The man's tormented and cutting himself with stones. He is isolated, tormented, violated, and self-destructive. And some of you know exactly what that feels like. And all of us are kind of here, you know, that we were conceived in sin, brought forth in iniquity, children of the devil, desperately in need of God's grace. This is the story of every human being. And yet for many of us, we understand, no, you know what it is, that maybe some curiosity got you to start playing with some things that really ended up playing with you. And you got to some places online, you got to some videos, some images, some relationships, some conversations. You got into a relationship with a guy or a girl, you started journeying into some spaces that you thought you were in control of, and now it's in control of you. And quite honestly, I think a lot of you in here probably didn't worship at all in the opening set. It's not because they didn't do a great job. It's because you don't even know if you should be here. Because when you look at yourself, you go, I'm defiled, I'm unclean, and I'm isolated, and I'm denigrated, and I'm self-destructive. My question is, what does God do with you? Does Jesus push this man away? No. Jesus uses his power to set him free. What are the purposes of Jesus? He uses his power in service of his love. Jesus Christ has all the power of the Almighty, and he is moving. Why? To set you free. There are some things that have dominated you that need not dominate you anymore. Things that have defined you that need not define you anymore. There are some things that are bound you that are not too strong for him. And it is deeply satisfying as a human being to know the most powerful being in the room knows you and loves you. Yeah. So I remember for me, when I was a kid, we would play kickball in my cul-de-sac with all the kids from the neighborhood. And there was one day we were playing kickball and I went inside to get a drink of water. And when I came out, they weren't playing kickball, but they were all in my yard. I was like, why are you in my yard? And they were like, we were playing kickball, and they were telling the story, and they're like, and we were out there, and he came out. And I knew who they were talking about. It was this man down the street that was a bully. I mean, he's like a grown man, but he would pick on us kids. He'd make fun of us, and there's nothing we could do about it. He was bigger than us. And he had decided he wanted to do something on the street, like play volleyball with his friends. And so he told us, hey, you kids get out of here. And we were in the middle of a game. So he just walked into our game, grabbed the ball, threw it in the trunk of his car. Like, what are you gonna do? And they're telling me the story. And I'm like, this is not new. This is not news. This is how this man always treated us. He's bigger than us, dominated us. And they were like, yeah, Ben, but something changed. Your dad came home and he saw him. Now, my dad, we used to have a game when we were kids called Punch Dad in the Stomach as Hard as You Can. And his abs were so rock solid, it would hurt our wrist. Dad had a game called Throw the Kids in the Air. And I didn't like that game because I was up there too long. Like, you got to bring something to do. And they said, your dad came home and your dad saw it. And my dad's not a screamer, but they said, Ben, your dad walked up to that man and we saw veins pop out in places we'd never seen him before. And your dad walked up to that man and said, you leave these kids alone. And they said, and we watched this man melt against his car. He unlocked the trunk, gave us the ball, started apologizing, handed us all money. They were telling us a story. And I remember sitting there and it was so awesome. As a kid, like, you're talking about my dad. Like the thing that dominated us, terrified us, ruled us, powerless before this man. And he's mine, and he knows me, and he loves me. And it was awesome the rest of my life, whenever the conversation broke out of like, whose dad could beat up somebody else's dad, I never said anything because they would all be like, we all know Ben's dad would win. I submit my father's number 2 for the following reasons. And on the conversation would go. But it was amazing in a child's heart to know that the most powerful one loves me, cares about me. And what scares me doesn't scare him. What dominates me does not dominate him. He is powerful. He is awesome. And he uses his power in service of his love. And some of you are here at Passion 2023 because a powerful, awesome, loving Jesus has come to set you free. That's who he is. That's what he's like. And yet some of you hear that and you go, well, Ben, I got problems and he hadn't solved them. I've been around the church and I don't understand why he waits so long to reconcile some issues with me. Let me close by looking briefly at this last story about the priorities of Jesus. It says in verse 21, after he had healed that man and he was seated and clothed in his right mind, brought back to sanity by the grace of Jesus. It says in verse 21, and Jesus crossed again by the boat to the other side, and a great crowd gathered around him. He was beside the sea, and there came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and seeing him, he fell at his feet. Demon-possessed naked guy and leader of the synagogue, both falling at Jesus' feet by the side of the sea. Everybody needs this man, and everyone falls before him. And here Jairus comes and strings together the most tragic collection of words I can imagine. My little daughter is at the point of death. He says, but if you come and touch her, she'll be made well. And Jesus consents to go. This man has faith. But then as they begin to move, it says the great crowd thronged him. And you think that sets up the tension of the story. Can they get there in time? Jesus has the power to heal, but there's a great crowd. They're crushing in on him. And you think that's the drama. We got to get there. Can we make it? Everybody move. She's at the point of death and they're starting to move. And then suddenly Mark breaks into the detailed medical history of some random lady in the crowd. Oh, but there was a lady there. She was bleeding. And for 12 years. And she'd spent all her money on doctors and wasn't better, was actually worse. And you're like, oh, okay, that's tragic, but we got a little girl dying here. And he's like, this lady thought, if I can just touch the hem of his robe, I'll be healed. And if you're reading this, you're like, fine, just do it from the back, just touch and go, just get out of the way. And yet she comes up and touches his robe and she instantly feels that she's been healed. And yet in that moment, Jesus stops and he says, hey, somebody touch me. And his disciples are like, this great crowd is all over us. And you say, who touched me? Are you serious? And Jesus won't let it go. Did you notice in the text, it says he starts looking for her? He's like, no, somebody touch me. Somebody, hey, guys, time out. I was walking and somebody touched me. So was it you? Did you do it? We're gonna figure this, you know what we're doing? We're not going anywhere until we figure out who's touching me. And he starts this thing. How does Jairus feel? What are you doing? My daughter's at the point of death. What's going on with this? And it says that the woman, she had great fear. She didn't want this. No one wanted this. She wanted to touch and go. Jairus wants to move. Only Jesus wants this. What is he doing? And finally the lady realizes he's not gonna let this go. And she comes forward and tells him the whole story. And he looks at her and he says, daughter, your faith has healed you. Go and be healed of your disease. She already knew the back part, that she was healed. She felt it. What mattered to Jesus, his priority, is I want you to know it's your faith in me that made you well. See, she was in jeopardy of having a shallow, superstitious kind of religion. I'm just trying to solve my problems, and if throwing up a little prayer or doing some kind of religious service can help me get where I need to go, I'm gonna do that. And Jesus is rescuing her from a shallow superstition and saying, no, I need you to understand what mattered in this moment was me, and you trusted me, and I want you to trust me. And it's worth stopping the world to get that right. Some of Jairus' people come up and say, don't bother the teacher anymore. Your daughter's dead. Jesus looks at him and says, don't be afraid. Believe. They show up in that moment and people think Jesus is crazy and he casts them all out. And then he strings together one of the most beautiful statements you can imagine. Mark tells it to us twice in 2 different languages. Talitha kumi, little girl, rise. And she does. And here in that moment, you go, what was the priority of Jesus? He's got power over everything you're scared of or worried about right now. And he uses that power in the service of his love. That's his purpose. His purpose with his power is to set you free. And his priority is, I want you to trust me. And when you trust me, I will take longer than you want me to take. I won't solve your problem in the timing you want me to solve it. I won't do it in the way you want me to solve it. But if you trust me, she just wanted a little healing. She got an audience with the King of the universe who looked her in the face and called her daughter. He just wanted Jesus to get rid of his sickness. Jesus said, no, Jairus, I want you to watch me beat death. That Jesus did not give them what he wanted, but he gave them something better. And what he asks of them is don't fear, believe. And they're overcome with amazement. And for you, friend, we have a Jesus who is powerful over all creation. His purpose is his love to set you free from what you're bound up with. That does not need to dominate your story. He is stronger than what is stronger than you. But his priority is he wants you to trust him. He wants you to trust him. Last story, when I left college, I remember right out of college, I got a call from my little sister. She was in college, she was studying in England, and she was with a friend, and she said, hey, we're gonna go to Italy, but we've made no preparations. We have nowhere to stay, we don't know what we're doing, so I need my big brother to show up and help us and meet us in Rome by that statue, that one guy. It's very stressful. So I show up there, and we end up having a good time, but we had made no plans. And so we showed up, and I remember at one point we went to Cinque Terre, this beautiful city along the coast. And while we were in Cinque Terre, we're trying to call these different hostels, hotels, anywhere to get a place to stay. And we can't find a single one. There is no room in the inn. And finally, at the very end of the day, this one hostel owner just feels bad for us. And he's like, hey, look, I'll stay at a friend's house tonight. Y'all can rent my house. So he offers us his house and he gives us the address. And as we leave, my sister was doing something and her friend had a disease that was degenerative to her bones and to her joints. Walking was excruciating, which makes a town filled with cobblestones and rocks and a walking city very painful, but she was tough. She would just kind of deal. She just kind of dealt with Rome and she dealt with Florence and she just kind of grit her teeth and made it happen because she was somebody who was strong. But when we got to Cinque Terre late at night, it took so long. Finally, we get this guy's address and we look it up and it's at the very top of this long, windy hill. And I remember as we look at it for the first time, I saw her break. She was so strong, so capable. But as she felt all the pain and saw the obstacles, she's like, I can't elevate to that. And she started crying. And I don't like telling stories where I'm the Jesus character in it. This is really the only one. Usually I'm the guy messing things up. But I looked at her and I said, look, I'm gonna have to carry you if we're gonna get where we're meant to be. And so I remember I put her on my back and I started up this hill. And as we did it, I could feel her just moving all around, all over me. Like she was doing some kind of, I don't know what she was doing. And finally at one point I just stopped and I said, what are you doing? And she said, I'm trying to help you. And I said, this is not helping me. I just need you to be still. let me carry you. I just tell that story because so many of you, you're strong and you're just trying so hard to get it all figured out. And I just wonder if while we're here at Passion, you could just be still. Let him carry you. He's strong enough to carry you. He's loving enough to want to, and he's wise enough to know when and how. Will you trust him? He's worthy of your trust, and he's worthy of your awe.